The bus wheezed to a stop at the edge of nowhere, and Daniel stepped onto cracked asphalt with everything he owned stuffed into a single duffel bag. The small town stretched before him like a faded photograph, weathered storefronts, empty sidewalks, and the kind of silence that promised anonymity. Perfect. He needed to disappear, to become invisible after the explosion that had torn his old life apart. The memory of his father's face, twisted with disgust, still burned behind his eyes every time he closed them. 3 days of walking and asking led him to Mel's Diner, a tired building with peeling paint and a help-wanted sign hanging crooked in the window. The owner, a woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted aprons, hired him on the spot when he said he could start immediately. No questions asked about where he'd come from or why he looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. The job was simple: serve coffee, take orders, keep his mouth shut and his head down. Drop a red heart if this hits you, because finding your place in the world isn't always easy. The diner became his sanctuary, a place where he could lose himself in the rhythm of clinking dishes and brewing coffee. He rented a tiny room above the hardware store, bare walls and a single window that looked out onto the main street. It wasn't much, but it was his. Every dollar he earned went into a coffee tin hidden under his mattress, savings for whatever came next, because this was temporary. Everything was temporary now. But the loneliness crept in during the quiet hours between customers, settling in his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. He'd catch himself watching couples share meals, families laugh together, and feel the hollow ache of being completely alone. This was safety, he reminded himself. This was survival. Even if it felt like he was slowly disappearing, even from himself. Daniel had fallen into a comfortable rhythm at the diner, moving through his shifts with mechanical precision, when everything changed on a Tuesday morning in late September. The bell above the door chimed, and Daniel looked up from wiping down tables to see a man he'd never encountered before, tall, dark-haired, with an easy confidence that seemed to fill the entire space. There was something different about him, something that made Daniel's pulse quicken in a way he'd trained himself to ignore. "Good morning," the stranger said, sliding into a booth by the window. His smile was warm, genuine, and directed entirely at Daniel. "I'm Chase. I'll be in town for a few days on business. Heard this was the best coffee around." Daniel felt heat rise in his cheeks as he approached with the coffee pot. "I don't know about best," he managed, "but it's hot and strong." Up close, he could see the laugh lines around Chase's eyes, the way his shirt fit perfectly across his shoulders, and something else, a comfort with himself that Daniel envied immediately. "Daniel," he said when Chase asked his name, then immediately regretted offering even that small piece of himself. But Chase just nodded, like the name was worth remembering. "Well, Daniel, I have a feeling I'll be seeing a lot of you this week." As the days passed, Chase kept his word. He appeared every morning at 8:30 sharp, always requesting Daniel's section, always lingering over his coffee longer than necessary. He talked easily about his work in marketing, his life in the city, asking Daniel questions that went beyond the usual customer small talk. "You're not from around here," Chase observed on his third visit, stirring sugar into his coffee. "I can tell. You've got that look of someone who's still figuring out where they belong." Daniel's hand tightened on his order pad. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who's been there," Chase said softly, and something in his tone made Daniel's chest tighten with recognition. Each morning, Daniel found himself anticipating Chase's arrival, checking his reflection in the bathroom mirror, making sure Chase's coffee was perfect. It terrified him, this growing anticipation, the way his heart jumped when the door chimed at exactly 8:30. He'd catch himself watching Chase's hands as he turned the pages of his newspaper, noticing the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, storing up these small details like treasures. "You know," Chase said on Friday morning, "I'll be back next week. Same project, same terrible hotel coffee." He paused, meeting Daniel's eyes directly. "I'm hoping you'll still be here." "I'm not going anywhere," Daniel replied, and realized with a jolt that for the first time in months, he wasn't sure if that was resignation or hope. The next morning brought a familiar routine, but Daniel felt different somehow. As he went through the motions of opening the diner, checking inventory, and preparing for the breakfast rush, he couldn't shake the memory of Chase's easy smile or the way their conversation had flowed so naturally. It terrified him how much he was looking forward to seeing him again. When Chase walked through the door at his usual time, Daniel's heart did that stuttering thing again. He tried to keep his expression neutral as he poured coffee, but Chase's warm greeting made his defenses feel paper-thin. "Morning, Daniel. You look like you slept well," Chase said, settling into what had become his regular booth. "Well enough," Daniel replied, though the truth was he'd spent half the night replaying their conversation. "The usual? Actually, I was thinking of trying something different today. What do you recommend?" The question felt loaded somehow, like they weren't just talking about breakfast anymore. Daniel found himself studying Chase's face, searching for hidden meanings in every word. This was exactly what he'd been afraid of, the way Chase made him feel like there might be more beneath the surface of their interactions. "The pancakes are good," Daniel said finally. "Bet he makes them from scratch." "I'll trust your judgment," Chase said, and there was something in his tone that made Daniel's pulse quicken. Over the next hour, their conversation meandered through safe topics: the weather, the town's upcoming summer festival, Chase's work. But Daniel noticed how Chase's questions seemed designed to draw him out, to learn more about who he was beneath the surface. It felt like being studied under a microscope, and Daniel found himself growing increasingly uncomfortable. "So what brought you to this town?" Chase asked during a lull in the conversation. "You don't strike me as someone who's lived here all his life." Daniel's hand tightened on the coffee pot. "Just needed a change of scenery," he said, keeping his voice deliberately light. "Sometimes you need to get away from everything familiar." "I understand that," Chase said quietly, "though I've found that running from things doesn't always solve them." The words hit too close to home, and Daniel felt his walls slam back into place. "I'm not running from anything," he said, more sharply than he intended. "Some people just prefer a quieter life." Chase held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I didn't mean to imply anything. I just recognize the look sometimes, that feeling of being displaced." "You don't know anything about me," Daniel said, immediately regretting the defensive edge in his voice. He forced himself to soften his tone. "I mean, I'm just a guy who works at a diner. Nothing complicated about that." But Chase didn't look convinced, and Daniel hated how exposed he felt under that perceptive gaze. There was something about the way Chase looked at him that suggested he saw through the careful facade Daniel had constructed, and that possibility was both thrilling and absolutely terrifying. "Actually," Chase said, his voice taking on a casual tone that somehow felt deliberate, "I noticed there's a Pride event happening in the next town over this weekend. I was thinking of checking it out. It's been a while since I've been to one. You interested in coming along?" The question hit Daniel like a physical blow. His breath caught, and he felt the color drain from his face. The coffee pot trembled in his hand, and he had to set it down before he dropped it. That's not really my thing," he managed, his voice sounding strained even to his own ears. Chase's expression shifted, becoming more watchful. "It's just a community event," he said carefully. "Good food, live music, people celebrating who they are. Nothing scary about it." "I said no," Daniel replied, more forcefully than necessary. The panic was rising in his chest now, that familiar feeling of being cornered, of having his carefully constructed world threatened. "I need to get back to work." He turned away abruptly, busying himself with unnecessary tasks at the counter. Behind him, he heard Chase's quiet sigh, and when he finally worked up the courage to glance back, Chase was leaving money on the table and heading for the door. "See you tomorrow, Daniel," Chase said softly, and there was something in his voice, disappointment, maybe, or understanding, that made Daniel's chest ache. After Chase left, Daniel stood behind the counter, his hand shaking slightly as he replayed the conversation. He'd overreacted, and they both knew it. The way Chase had mentioned pride so casually, like it was the most natural thing in the world, had sent Daniel spiraling back to all the reasons he'd fled to this small town in the first place. But even as he tried to convince himself that maintaining distance was the smart choice, Daniel couldn't ignore the hollow feeling in his chest. For a brief moment, Chase had offered him something he'd thought was impossible, a glimpse of what it might be like to be himself without fear. And Daniel had thrown it back in his face. The rest of his shift passed in a blur of second-guessing and regret. He found himself watching the door, hoping Chase might return, while simultaneously dreading the conversation they'd need to have if he did. The easy comfort of their previous interactions felt shattered, replaced by an awkward tension that left Daniel feeling more isolated than ever. By closing time, Daniel had convinced himself that Chase wouldn't be back. He'd revealed too much with his reaction, and now Chase knew exactly what kind of person he was, A coward who couldn't even handle a simple invitation to a community event. The thought of losing these daily conversations, these moments of connection he'd grown to treasure, felt like losing something vital. As he locked up the diner, Daniel caught his reflection in the window and saw a man who looked haunted by his own fears. He'd spent so long protecting himself that he'd forgotten how to take even the smallest risks, and now he was paying the price for his cowardice. The thunderstorm hit on a Tuesday evening, turning the usually quiet diner into a sanctuary against the harsh weather outside. Daniel watched through the rain-streaked windows as lightning illuminated the empty parking lot, grateful for the distraction from his thoughts. He'd been replaying his last conversation with Chase for 3 days now, analyzing every word and gesture, wondering if he'd completely destroyed whatever fragile connection they'd built. The bell above the door chimed, and Daniel's heart skipped when he saw Chase shaking rainwater from his jacket. Their eyes met across the empty dining room, and Daniel felt that familiar mixture of relief and anxiety wash over him. Chase looked different somehow, more serious than usual, and Daniel wondered if he was finally going to address the elephant in the room. "Coffee?" Daniel asked, trying to keep his voice steady as Chase settled into his usual booth. "Please," Chase replied, his smile softer than usual. "And maybe some of that pie if you have any left." Daniel busied himself with the coffee pot, hyper-aware of Chase's presence in the otherwise empty diner. The storm had apparently kept everyone else home, leaving just the two of them in the warm circle of light that felt both comforting and dangerous. When Daniel set the cup down, Chase's fingers brushed his briefly, sending electricity through him that had nothing to do with the lightning outside. "Slow night," Chase observed, glancing around the empty restaurant. "The storm's keeping people in," Daniel replied, sliding into the booth across from him without really thinking about it. It wasn't until he was seated that he realized he'd never done that before, never presumed to join Chase during his visits. If Chase was surprised, he didn't show it. Instead, he leaned back slightly, studying Daniel with those perceptive eyes that always seemed to see too much. "You know, I've been thinking about our last conversation." Daniel's stomach clenched. "Look, if this is about the pride thing, I didn't mean to." "You don't have to explain," Chase interrupted gently. "I just want you to know that I wasn't trying to make you uncomfortable. Sometimes I forget that not everyone has the luxury of being open about who they are." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Daniel's chest tight. Chase wasn't pushing, wasn't demanding explanations, but somehow that made it worse. The kindness in his voice was almost unbearable. "I'm not from here," Daniel found himself saying, the words coming out before he could stop them. "This town, I mean. I came here because I needed to disappear for a while." Chase nodded slowly, as if he'd suspected as much. "Running from something?" "Running from everything," Daniel admitted, surprised by his own honesty. The storm outside seemed to create a cocoon around them, making confessions feel safer somehow. "My family, my old life, people who thought they knew who I was supposed to be." "And who are you supposed to be?" The question was asked so simply, without judgment or expectation, that Daniel felt something crack open inside his chest. He'd been carrying the weight of other people's expectations for so long that he'd almost forgotten there might be another way to exist. "I don't know anymore," he said quietly. "I used to think I knew, but then everything fell apart, and I realized I'd been living someone else's life all along." Chase reached across the table, covering Daniel's hand with his own. The touch was warm and steady, anchoring him to the moment. "I spent years trying to be who other people wanted me to be," Chase said softly. "It nearly killed me. Not literally, but in all the ways that matter." Daniel looked down at their joined hands, feeling something shift inside him. "How did you stop?" "I got tired of being lonely in a room full of people who supposedly loved me. I realized that hiding who I was might keep me safe, but it also kept me from ever really being seen." Chase's thumb traced gentle circles on Daniel's knuckles. "And I wanted to be seen. I wanted to be known." The vulnerability in Chase's voice made Daniel's throat tight. What if being seen means losing everything again? What if hiding means never having anything real at all? The question hit Daniel like a physical blow. He thought about his empty apartment, his careful routines, the way he'd built his life around avoiding connection. He was safe, yes, but he was also completely alone. "I see you," Chase said quietly. "I don't know your whole story, but I see you. The way you care about people, how you remember exactly how everyone likes their coffee, the way you light up when you think no one's watching. I see you, Daniel." Daniel felt tears prick his eyes, overwhelmed by the simple gift of being recognized. For months, he'd felt invisible, and now Chase was offering him the thing he'd been afraid to want, acceptance without conditions. Outside, the storm was beginning to pass, but inside the diner, something fundamental had shifted between them. Daniel realized that Chase had been patient, waiting for him to be ready for this moment of connection, and the thought filled him with something that felt dangerously close to hope. The next evening, Daniel found himself glancing at the clock more frequently than usual, his stomach tightening with each passing minute. Chase hadn't shown up at his regular time, and the absence felt like a physical weight in Daniel's chest. He'd been replaying their conversation from the storm night over and over, wondering if he'd revealed too much, if Chase had seen through his carefully constructed walls and decided the effort wasn't worth it. When the bell above the door finally chimed at 8:30, Daniel's relief was so immediate it nearly buckled his knees. Chase walked in with that familiar easy smile, but there was something different in his eyes tonight, a determination that made Daniel's pulse quicken. "Sorry I'm late," Chase said, sliding into his usual booth. "Got caught up in a call that ran long." Daniel poured coffee without being asked, his hand steadier than he felt. "No problem. Quiet night anyway." Chase wrapped his fingers around the mug, studying Daniel's face with an intensity that made him want to look away. "I've been thinking about what you said last night. About feeling displaced." "Chase? Let me finish." His voice was gentle but firm. "I know what it's like to feel like you don't belong anywhere. And I know what it's like to build walls so high that even you forget what's on the other side of them." Daniel's throat tightened. He glanced around the empty diner, grateful for the solitude even as it made him feel more exposed. "The thing is," Chase continued, "sometimes someone comes along who's willing to help you remember, who sees past the walls to what you're protecting." "What are you saying?" Chase leaned forward slightly. "I'm saying I'd like to take you to dinner. A real dinner. Not here, not with you working, just us. Tomorrow night, if you're willing." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. His first instinct was to retreat, to deflect with humor or find an excuse. The familiar panic rose in his chest, the same fear that had driven him to this town in the first place. But underneath the panic was something else, something that had been growing stronger with each of Chase's visits. "I don't know if that's a good idea," Daniel said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Why not?" The simple question hung between them. Daniel could feel Chase waiting, not pushing, just giving him space to answer honestly. It was the same patience Chase had shown him from the beginning, the same willingness to let Daniel set the pace. "Because..." Daniel started, then stopped. How could he explain that he was terrified of wanting something he couldn't have? That he'd been hurt before by people who'd claimed to accept him? That the idea of Chase seeing all of him, really seeing him, was both everything he wanted and everything he feared? "Because I'm not who you think I am," he finally said. Chase's smile was soft, understanding. "Daniel, I've been coming here for 2 months. I've watched you work, listened to you talk, seen how you treat people. I've seen you be kind to difficult customers, patient with the old-timers who nurse their coffee for hours, gentle with the kids who come in after school. I've seen you laugh when you think no one's looking, and I've seen you retreat when you think someone's getting too close." Daniel's hands stilled on the counter. "I think I know exactly who you are," Chase continued. "And I think you're worth dinner. Worth conversation. Worth knowing better." The words cracked something open in Daniel's chest. He thought about the months of loneliness, the careful distance he'd maintained, the way he convinced himself that hiding was the same as being safe. But safety without connection wasn't really living. It was just existing. "There's a lot you don't know about me," Daniel said quietly. "I know. That's what dinner is for." Daniel looked at Chase, really looked at him. He saw the genuine interest in his eyes, the way he'd never pushed for more than Daniel was ready to give, the patience that had waited through all of Daniel's careful deflections. And he realized that he was tired. Tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of pretending that he didn't want exactly what Chase was offering. "Okay," he said, the word coming out barely above a whisper. Chase's smile was brilliant. "Okay. Yes. Dinner. Tomorrow night." Chase picked a quiet restaurant 2 towns over, somewhere we could talk without curious eyes from the diner crowd. The drive there felt like crossing into another world, one where I might actually be allowed to exist as myself. My hands trembled as I studied the menu, not from nerves about the food, but from the weight of what I knew I needed to say. "You don't have to be nervous," Chase said gently, reaching across the table to still my fidgeting fingers. It's just dinner. Just us. But it wasn't just dinner, and we both knew it. This was the moment I'd been running from for months, the conversation that would either set me free or send me packing to the next town. I took a shaky breath and met his eyes. I need to tell you something, I began, my voice barely above a whisper. About why I really came to town. About why I've been so. I gestured vaguely at myself, at the careful distance I'd maintained. Chase leaned forward, his expression patient and encouraging. I'm listening. The words came in a rush then, like a dam finally bursting. I told him about my family, about the night they threw me out, about the fear that had driven me to hide in a town where nobody knew my name. I told him about the loneliness, about watching him walk into the diner and feeling something I'd convinced myself I'd never be allowed to feel again. I'm gay, I said finally, the words hanging in the air between us. And I'm terrified of what that means for my life, for any chance at happiness. Chase was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of my hand. When he spoke, his voice was soft but steady. Daniel, I've been hoping you'd trust me enough to tell me this for weeks now, he said. I've been coming to that diner 3 times a week, not for the coffee. My heart stuttered. What? I've been hoping you'd see that I'm interested in you. Not just as a friend. His smile was tender, vulnerable in a way that made my chest tight. I've been hoping you'd realize that being gay doesn't have to mean being alone. The relief that flooded through me was so intense I nearly laughed. Here I'd been, terrified of his rejection, while he'd been waiting patiently for me to see what was right in front of me. I don't know how to do this, I admitted. I don't know how to be myself and not be afraid. We'll figure it out together, Chase said simply. One dinner at a time. 3 months later, Daniel signed a lease on a small apartment above the bookstore downtown. No more motel rooms, no more running, just keys to a place he could finally call home. Chase had restructured his consulting business, spending 4 days a week in town instead of just passing through. They'd fallen into an easy rhythm. Morning coffee at the diner before Daniel's shift, evening walks through the quiet streets, weekends exploring the hiking trails that wound through the surrounding hills. You know what's funny? Daniel said one evening as they sat on his tiny balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. I came here to disappear, but I feel more visible than ever. Chase reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. Good visible or scary visible? Good, Daniel said without hesitation. Really good. The diner had become something entirely different from his original hiding place. Martha knew about Chase now, often setting aside extra pie for him. The regular customers had accepted their relationship with the casual warmth of a small town that had decided to embrace rather than exclude. Daniel still carried the scars from his past, but they no longer defined his future. He'd learned that authenticity wasn't about fearlessness. It was about choosing truth despite the fear, trusting that some people would stay. Ready for tomorrow? Chase asked, squeezing his hand. Tomorrow they were driving to the city to meet Chase's friends. Another step forward, another choice to be seen. With you? Yeah, I'm ready.